Hey, and good day, everybody. This is Art Shed, and it's time for the show. Let's be reasonable. And, folks, hey, we are in episode 3 of our expose into what is wrong with the right. And, of course, just to kind of bring you up to speed with episodes 1 and 2, I'd advise you to go back and take a listen and look at those because it's important for you to know how this is all setting up. I'm getting somewhere. You'll know where I am by the end of episode 5. But take a look at episode 1 and 2. Highlights of episode 1, we talked about the 5 factions that make up the Republican Party and the fact that they're being led around by the populist faction of the Republican group today. They're getting some yeoman effort, help from the Faith and Flag group. That's the Christian Coalition, right? And for the most part, we talked about the fact that, hey, you know what? They're racking up wins when it comes to the courts, right? They're racking up wins when it comes to having the Supreme Court, right? What are they so upset about, right? How could you be upset? You get your way on affirmative action, you're getting your way on reproductive rights, you're getting your way on a number of different issues, even on the state level. Why are they still upset? I said, my hypothesis is they're upset because it has to be something economic, right? And I'll say this, I didn't say this in episode 1, but people who are happy economically really don't give two bleeps about what else may be happening, right? As long as the economics are right, I don't have anything else to worry about. So that's episode 1. In episode 2, I needed to take you down the economic lane. I needed to tell you about supply side economics and why that is the universe that everything shines in for Republicans. Everything starts and ends with supply side economics for them. So I called on Art Laffer in order to make that case. He put together a great little video. I think it was Hillsdale College that did it, but he talked about the components that make up supply side economics, and that being cutting taxes, cutting spending, cutting regulation. There was a not tax, but there was a free market component and a monetary component. I'm not going to deal too much with the last two, the free market component and the monetary component today. That's another show. But I want to deal with the other three. So when you finished listening to Art Laffer and got past the great music that was playing, what he told you was that supply side economics was going to make a way for the American people to have better roads, better housing, and better clothes. I mean, a better way of life. That's what Art Laffer was promising that we would have if we followed the model of supply side economics. So, I mean, okay, I allow that. That's good. That's good to know. But let's check out the record, right? So, and that's what we're going to do in this episode. In episode 3, let's discuss how supply side economics has actually worked, right? So, before we go too far, understand there's a supply side of things and then there's a demand side when it comes to economics, right? And the question is, which one of these do you want leading? Republicans want to lead on supply. And the reason why they're looking at supply, I got to tell you, I don't mind this thought process. If we increase the supply of, let's say, goods, then it will drive down the cost of those goods. So then Americans will be able to buy more of said goods, right? Easy concept to figure out. Now, on the demand side, demand is a little trickier in thought process because demand says, well, we want to increase the demand by, well, I mean, and we saw this with the Keynesian model. There was some degree of price controls, and there were some tariffs and other things that they used in order to manipulate the greater demand, right? So, I mean, the thought process of supply side economics at that level begins to make sense, but it needs incentives, right? And the incentives are the taxes picture, the cuts to spending, and the cuts to regulation, right? If we have those incentives, then again, it will spur that growth that we're looking for on the capital side for employers to be able to employ more people, people to be able to spend more money on goods and services, right? All these things will happen. Okay, so now the biggest component of this is the tax picture. And you have to understand, when you cut taxes, Republicans say that it will broaden the base, right? And it will create the revenue needed that you would have had at that higher tax level. Now, you can look at many different documents, but the record is not necessarily crystal clear, but I would say definitive that when you cut taxes, you're actually cutting revenues to the federal coffers. And what do I mean by the federal coffers? You're cutting taxes and the federal dollars needed in order to run the government. That meaning the congressional pay, right? And all the congressional aides and all the bureaucracy that makes up the federal government. That's where your tax dollars go. Okay. So if you cut those taxes, you're lowering the amount of revenue that comes in the system. That creates deficits. If you don't have enough money by the end of that budget cycle in order to pay off that deficit, guess what happens? It turns into debt. And that's where we arrive at our national debt. That's how that whole process works. Now, I can show you some of the information. Hopefully, this makes some sense. But here I'm looking at really 1982, 2024, and we're looking at the percentage of gross domestic product based on federal receipts. Now, I can just kind of point out to you the Reagan tax cuts happened here, right? Revenues fall. Okay. We get to the next cycle. Let's just go to the Clinton years. Would you see the Clinton years here? They did targeted tax cuts on the middle class in order to spur growth. And guess what? It created more revenues. All right. By the time you get to the Bush administration, everybody remembers the surplus that they had. Bush gave that surplus money back to the American people. And of course, it dropped revenues. Okay. And as you see this, remember what's also happening. We are now embarking on this war on terror, and we've created one of the largest government bureaucracies known as Homeland Security. I think Homeland Security is either number 3 or 4 when it comes to its size, right? And you could ask yourself, why is it that we create this in an era where we don't have the federal revenues, right? But we did it anyway. And it increased the deficits because you lost revenue, right? So by the time you get to the end of the Bush administration, look, revenues did eventually go up, not back to where they were in 2000, but they did kind of go back up, right? Now, but the financial crisis happened, revenues fell again, right? Now, Obama's in office. You see revenues pick up while he's in office at his peak, probably about, making up 17% of GDP. And then, of course, the tax cuts for the Trump team happened. We see this happen again, revenues fall, right? And of course, we had 2000, and now we're in 2022. No tax cut, but you can see this fall off in revenue. Interesting point. I'll make that point in the last episode as we get closer. Okay, so, all right. That's what the revenue picture looks like. I must tell you, you must also take a look at the deficit picture. Remember, if you don't have the revenue, you're creating deficits. So this is from 1930 until now. Okay, so, and you can see we ran small deficits, nothing to really worry about until really deficits started to pick up during the 70s. And then, of course, now we're embarking on supply side economics. The deficits have really, I can tell you this, by the time Reagan left office, the national debt had doubled. But anyway, you're going to run deficits in order to do that. And by the time you get to, again, the Clinton administration, you've reached a point where you're running a surplus. What does it mean to run a surplus? You're not running deficits. Actually, the federal income or money that's coming in has exceeded what you've needed, right? So after you've done all your budgeting for agencies and everything else, you have some money left over. And that's what you show here with this chart. Of course, it doesn't last because, again, I talked about the Bush administration and I talked about Clinton and taking over, not Clinton, Obama taking over during the collapse. All of this here is debt or deficits that lead to debt. The reason why you're running a national debt of $34 trillion, one of them, is because tax cuts create deficits. Deficits create debt. Okay, the national debt. Now, you can talk about the cutting spending. Two main reasons why it never happens. One, you don't want to get primaried if you're an elected official. And two, even though you can cut the bureaucracy, you're cutting the throats of Republicans as well as Democrats. So it turns out to be a bad way around all the way. So they embark not to cut spending. Okay, so, and then the other part is regulation. Deregulation sounds like a great thing because it gets government out of the way of corporations and allow them to do the things that they would like to do. The only problem is cutting regulation leads to bailouts. And as I'm pointing out with this particular page, you can see some of the largest bailouts in U.S. history, starting with, well, we're not going to talk about the Great Depression, but the savings and loans bailout in 1989. Remember, I'm tying this to supply side economic error. So you got to go from 1980 going forward. So savings and loans in 1989. You have the bank rescue of 2008. Now, in between 89 and 2008, I'm going to tell you, you also bailed out South Korea, you bailed out Mexico, and you bailed out Indonesia during the 1990s. Right? Then you have the 2008 Great Recession. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, Bear Stearns, AIG, and the COVID pandemic. The COVID pandemic turns out to be some of the largest debts that you're putting on the U.S. credit card that we obviously don't have the money to pay for. All right, so, but I want you to think about this. When Clinton was in office, Republicans came to him because remember, Republicans are running the House and the Senate during the 90s. They came to Clinton and said, hey, we needed to bail out North or South Korea, Indonesia, and Mexico. All right. There were no strings attached to that. When Obama decided he needed to bail out the car companies, bail out AIG, bail out all these different companies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, one of the cuts, or not cuts, one of the adages were these corporations had to pay the American people back. Okay. So when Republicans want it, it's a blank check. When Democrats are in place and need it, it always comes with cuts and concessions. I think that's very interesting. But that's where we are. So, look, the bottom line is this. You're here in this space today, $34 trillion worth of debt because of a tax situation that favors giving money back to the individual. We talked about that in episode 1. It's okay, or episode 2. It's okay to give this money back to the individuals. It truly is, right? But at the end of the day, it ends up hurting everyone because it doesn't produce better roads. You can look at the fact that we just got an infrastructure bill during the Biden administration. I can't tell you the last time we had one. I think it was a smaller package during the Bush years, right? Okay, folks. So the bottom line, when it comes to looking at the record of supply side economics and how it delivers when it comes to federal revenues, it doesn't deliver. And again, I will point out to you that supply side economics is, again, as I said in episode 2, good for the individual. The question is, what will the benefits be to everyone, right? Good for the individual. Can you get it to benefit everyone? That's the question. In this case, when you look at the tax picture, when you look at the facts that they don't make cuts to spending, and you look at the fact of deregulation, which leads to a lot of bailouts, you can say that supply side economics has a few problems, but there's other things you need to know. So, on to episode 4.